Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and good evening. We'll be getting started in just a moment as our numbers stabilize as people enter the Zoom. Looking forward to an inspiring conversation this evening. It's great to see those numbers continue to climb. There are hundreds of you from across the country who are already in, and we're just waiting for a few more to join us in the Zoom here before we get started. Looks like our numbers are leveling off. So, at the risk of some people missing the very beginning of my introductory remarks, which are not the reason that you've all joined us this evening, I'm going to jump into the program because I want us to have every moment possible with our speaker this evening, Alan Kessel, whom we're very grateful to have join us. Thank you all for joining us on this webinar, which is designed to educate and help you advocate. I'm Noah Shack. I'm CEO at the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, and welcome to our program this evening. This session is coming at a pivotal moment. In a sudden about-face 1 week ago, Prime Minister Carney announced Canada's intention to follow France and the United Kingdom and preemptively recognize a Palestinian state at the UN in September, without real conditions and based on the assurances of Mahmoud Abbas and the PA, notorious for corruption and financing terrorists, including the murderers of Canadians. Israeli hostages remain in captivity. Hamas is still entrenched in Gaza. And even under the most generous interpretation, this policy shift is an empty symbolic gesture that advances neither Palestinian nor Israeli interests and does nothing to alleviate the region's tragic humanitarian crisis or move the cause of peace forward. It changes nothing on the ground. At worst, Canada's new approach rewards and emboldens Hamas, which has openly celebrated the growing international momentum towards recognition. Following Canada's and other countries' announcements, Hamas cut contact with mediators involved in ceasefire and hostage negotiations. And just days after Prime Minister Carney signaled plans to recognize Palestinian statehood, terrorist groups released new horrific footage of hostages Evyatar David and Rom Braslavsky. These haunting images reawakened for so many of us memories from the bleakest chapter in our people's history. And Hamas is now calling for an escalation in violence and intimidations in cities, capitals, and public squares around the world, including here in Canada. And we saw one example in Victoria this week, while the Prime Minister was visiting the island, with the defacement of Canada's oldest active synagogue with vicious and violent hate. In these times, we need to come together as a community, like we're doing tonight, and continue the fight. We're here because our community is speaking out against premature and dangerous recognition of Palestinian statehood by the Government of Canada and the urgent need to take action to address anti-Semitism. We all have a role to play. We're going to give you some information and tools that will help you to act. But before we begin, I want to encourage everyone to call your member of parliament and book a meeting to speak with them. Tell them no statehood without real change, no abandoning the hostages. Tell them we need action now to fight the hate targeting our community here in Canada. Not only safety zones and security funding, yes, we need those things, but funding on par with communities in the UK, France, Australia, and other places who are facing similar threats with greater resources, and laws to stop the glorification of terrorism and violence running rampant across the country. Tonight's conversation will help you prepare to engage. And tomorrow, you'll receive a follow-up email with an advocacy brief and other key links to help guide your next steps. You can also visit our Action Hub at any point for talking points and an easy way to call your MP. Through actionhub.ca, 20,000 emails have already been sent, and 1,000 phone calls were made just on Friday to MPs. That's a great start. If enough of us speak up across the country, Jews and allies together, we can make an impact. Before we begin with the program, I just want to say one more thing. I want to mention our Jewish federations and thank them for partnering with us on this program, ensuring that we have reach all across this country. And of course, to the countless volunteers from coast to coast who are doing so much to support CEJA and our entire community through this challenging time. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague Lexi, who will moderate this evening's conversation. Lexi, over to you.
Thank you, Noah. I'm Lexi Fellis, Senior Director at CEJA, and I'm happy to say that over 2,000 people across Canada signed up for this event, and we received hundreds of questions from our audience in just 48 hours of putting this event together. So clearly, there is significant interest from our community on this topic, and to hear from Alan Kessel tonight. Your questions will form the basis of our moderated discussion. If we don't have time to get to your question today, please email us at info@ceja.ca. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce Alan Kessel, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a former Assistant Deputy Minister of Legal Affairs for Global Affairs Canada. With over 4 decades in Canadian diplomacy and legal affairs, he brings an unparalleled perspective on this issue and on the provision of legal policy advice to government. We've got a lot to get to, so let's dive right in. Alan, firstly, I'd like to thank you for being here with our community. We've seen devastating images from the region, horrific videos of our hostages last week. As someone that's guided by principle and law, how do we balance that human need to act with the need for the right policies and frameworks?
Well, first of all, Alexi and to Noah and to the team, thanks so much for having me on tonight. It's an absolute pleasure, and I'm humbled by so many people joining, and to have so many friends and colleagues and members of the community out there, and allies, and those who see an important discussion in what we're talking about. I mean, I agree with you entirely about the images that we've been seeing. I don't think anyone who's a parent, a grandparent, a sibling, a child can avoid feeling gut-wrenching emotions when we see not only our Jewish hostages being so badly treated, but also the innocent civilians in Gaza, who we also think about at this time as they are living under a very difficult situation with Hamas as their leadership. And I keep that in mind, that there are two realities that we're dealing with, that there are victims and oppressed on the part of Hamas, and also that we as Jews need to think about the innocents. You know, our history has taught us that even one life is a universe. So I come into this with great humility to talk about some of these very difficult subjects, because there are important issues that need to be developed. And maybe I haven't answered your question, but maybe you want to pose something out again.
Thank you, Alan, and for really grounding us in that humility as we begin what can be a bit of a technical conversation. As Noah mentioned, Canada announced its intention to recognize a Palestinian state. Drawing on your expertise, your experience from an international law perspective, can we start with what is actually required to recognize a state, and does the current Palestinian leadership meet that bar?
Well, I mean, this is a very interesting question. You've seen a lot of op-eds written about it. You've seen a lot of talking heads on television talking about it. There are any number of views that are being expressed. Certainly from my experience in government, I have seen any number of approaches. But clearly, one of the most stable approaches that we had used as Canada, and certainly Canada has up until this week used, are the principles that have been codified in the Montevideo Convention from 1933. And that convention basically coalesced what we call customary international law. That means that even though you may not be a party to that convention, which Canada isn't, that convention in and of itself does talk to what we need. And what we do need to have recognition is borders that are absolutely clear, that there are, so that defined territory, that there's a functioning government in that entity, that there is a population that you can measure, and that there's an ability to conduct international relations. And so when you ask the question, does this entity that Canada wants to recognize and call a state of Palestine actually meet those criteria? The answer is no. Or maybe it meets some of them, but it certainly doesn't meet the threshold, the high threshold of recognizing a state. And what does that mean, actually? Because I'm sure our Prime Minister was given some advice. I mean, I know that when I was in government, advice came from me and channeled through our colleagues, through ministers' offices and into the Prime Minister's office. They would know what the basic rules of the game are. And we also kept that very much in mind because Canada is a strong adherent to international law. If we start veering for political reasons, then we question all those other decisions we've made. And maybe we can come back to the question of Taiwan, because if you look at Taiwan, Taiwan meets all the criteria and more of the Montevideo Convention. But let's be realistic here. So when decisions are made by prime ministers or others in government, there's a combination of policy, politics, and law. And what I see here is that the government has made a decision based on politics and policy. Because if you do look at what's going on in the territories and in Gaza, that does not demonstrate the criteria of a state that you'd want to recognize, certainly not as Canada. I mean, remember that Canada has prescribed Hamas as a terrorist organization in our country. And Canada has had strong words about how the Palestinians are running their operation in the West Bank. And if you take a look at what the Prime Minister actually said in his statement, I've sort of thought about this a bit, and I've kind of called them post-conditions, not preconditions to statehood. Why post-conditions? Because the Prime Minister has essentially said, we're going to recognize you in September. And I'm doing this knowing after our conversation together, Mr. Abbas, that you have said you're going to change your governance structure. You're going to not engage with Hamas. You're going to have elections in 2026, which won't have Hamas involved, and that you're going to demilitarize. That's what I read in the Prime Minister's statement. So he has taken a promise, a statement from Mr. Abbas, which I would think either we as Canada are naive or we just haven't looked at the possibility of how this is going to be fulfilled. So these are post conditions because he's going to give the prize away in September and then sit there and hope that all of these other conditions are going to come into effect. So when you ask, can they live up to it? You know, if the future, if the past is a predictor of the future, I would say 100% no. And if those of us who do read polls, and some polls have come out recently on voting patterns, were there to be an election in the West Bank at least, there a majority, if not a major majority, would vote for Hamas, even though they wouldn't be on the ballot. And another predictor of democracy is, as we all know, is Mr. Abbas is in the 19th year of his 4-year mandate. So every indicator to anyone looking at the situation would say No. So then there must be another reason. And that's obviously political. So if you're not living up to the law, it's political.
So let's dig in a bit to what the Prime Minister announced. How do Canada's longstanding principles on recognition compare to what the Prime Minister is now proposing? What's changed and why does that matter?
Well, when I look at what does Canada's recognition really do and what does it mean? So I can't help with not being cynical and thinking that it's largely symbolic. Essentially, recognition doesn't create a functioning state because nothing will change on the ground in Gaza or the West Bank. I mean, do you see our recognition of this state bringing together the West Bank and Gaza? You remember that when Gaza broke away, if you think about it in a federal way, because we're a federation, so you think about the federal government sitting in Ramallah, and we have one of the provinces called Gaza, and an election was held in the province of Gaza, whereby Hamas came in, but still the federal government of the Palestinian entity at the time was Fatah. But all of us know that what ended up happening is there was a coup, that the elected provincial government of Gaza overthrew the federal representatives in Gaza and essentially, as all of us know, threw them off the roof, and that they haven't had a relationship since. So we have these almost two states. Is he recognizing two states? So what you've got is Hamas governing Gaza. You've got the Palestinian Authority very weak in the West Bank, and the borders and security and access remain under Israeli control. So what does this thing actually do? I mean, from my perspective, and I think what I've certainly shared in what I've written, but also not uniquely because so many others have written the same thing, is this is a reward to terror. As I mentioned before, Hamas is a listed terrorist organization. And what they're seeing, because even Noah mentioned it in his introductory remarks, Hamas is now pulling away from their negotiations. So they're saying this is proof that violence works. If you're really violent enough, if you treat your own citizens, to call them what they are, as human shields or human sacrifices, then you actually get what you need to get. So it also signals to extremists in Canada that we will grant political legitimacy even while hostages remain in terrorism, and the terrorism continues. So the people on the streets of Canada who are jumping up and down, probably joyously for this, are seeing that Canada will reward terrorism and will say, if you are bad enough, we'll give you what you want. What does this do for us? And I'm wondering, there's 147 countries that have already recognized a Palestinian state purely on the notion of the politics. So with France, Canada, and the UK coming along, that would bring it to 150. But it would put us out of step with one of our important allies, which is the US. And I think Canada has enough to deal with without putting itself out of step with the US. And it would put us in alignment with, Spain and Ireland and France. But also the risks are to the relationship with Israel. And we've seen that relationship has become very frosty. And it puts the Canadian Jewish community, certainly in Canada, under extreme pressure. It will embolden anti-Israel activists and could escalate anti-Semitism. So, and it wouldn't be wrong if many people watching this webinar feel abandoned by their government. And so the question is, how do we, as people with good conscience and Jews in our community, how do we stand up and speak out. And I hope tonight is part of that awakening that we need to do that.
And I think that it was posted in the chat, the readout from the Prime Minister's phone call with Mahmoud Abbas, and I would really encourage the audience to read exactly what was discussed in this one phone call that seemingly changed Canada's position. Alan, you touched on some of those implications, short-term, long-term implications of recognizing a Palestinian state now, while Hamas is in Gaza, while our hostages are still there. What are some implications that perhaps we wouldn't have thought of, ones that are really keeping you up at night if the government moves ahead with this decision?
Well, the law of unintended consequences, or maybe there was an intended consequence. So first of all, there would have to be legislation changed in Canada to do this. Because if we're recognizing a state in September and we believe that the state is made up of Gaza and the West Bank, I think there'd be some incredible dancing around in order to say, oh, no, we're only recognizing a state as governed by the PA. Now, some would argue, well, you don't have to have relations with a government to recognize a state, and that's absolutely true. You can recognize that a state exists because it's got the borders and the people and capacity, but you don't have to have relations with that government. We don't have relations with Iran, but we recognize that the Iranian state exists. But I think that's going to be sort of so much pretzeling legally and otherwise to do. So just think about it. If you do want to go the full hog, you'd actually have to take Hamas off the terrorist listing, wouldn't you? I mean, that's what I'm thinking. But what else would it do? If you recognize this entity as a state, we have made it very clear in the international community, in any multilateral forum that we're in, and with any international agreement that we've signed forever, that we do not recognize the state of Palestine, the existing entity that is performing internationally, as an existence. If we were to say now they have an existence, this could impact on how we treat, for instance, the fact that Netanyahu and Gallant have been charged at the International Criminal Court. Because up to now, we have said we don't consider the state of Palestine to be a party to the International Criminal Court statute, and as such does not impact on Canada. We would then have to deliberate as a government as to whether we suddenly are changing that and what that would mean. Now, I don't think Prime Minister Netanyahu or former Defense Minister Gallant are making an early visit to Canada, but it would change the nature of how we were to view that organization's legal capacity to issue those warrants. That's just one. Once you start pulling at this sweater, a lot of it's going to come undone, because there are many, many international treaties where we have said we do not consider Palestine, in quotes, to be a party and have a relationship with Canada. And so we will see a ripple effect. Once the stone goes into this pond, there'll be a ripple effect of unintended consequences that we will see come down the pipe.
And one of the consequences and the impacts that you touched on already is the domestic impact. Since the Prime Minister's announcement, we've already seen the Jewish community uninvited and then re-invited to Montreal Pride, thanks to outcry from the community. We've seen open call to murder Jews scrawled on a synagogue in Victoria, BC. And then just this afternoon, Hamas said that it, quote, high values and appreciates the global movement against Israel, and called for an escalation of protests around the world. In Canada, we've seen these protests openly calling for violence against Jews. And this isn't a legal question here, Alan, but based on your experience as a diplomat, but also as a father, as a grandfather, how concerned should we be that this recognition emboldens anti-Semites, or that it legitimizes these one-sided measures against Israel here in Canada?
Well, let's move from the intellectual to the emotional, because the head and the heart, they are connected. But if you start with the head, wouldn't you, as a prime minister of a government that you consider to be a liberal democracy, wonder that when a prescribed terrorist group that you've prescribed is thanking you for your actions, wouldn't you ask yourself, is something really badly wrong here? This is not the first time we've got it. This is probably the third or fourth, and one of my colleagues could probably correct me on it. But just from a credibility point of view, when terrorists are saying thank you, there's something wrong. If the Taliban had thanked us, there's something wrong. If ISIS had thanked us, there's something wrong. You know what is wrong? Is that in 2001, when the Twin Towers came down and 24 Canadians were killed, murdered in that event, we joined our ally, the United States, together with a coalition in Operation Enduring Freedom. And we flew across the globe with our military, and we bombed the living daylights out of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And we didn't warn them we were coming. We just came and we did it. And we effected regime change. And we stayed there for 10 years because 24 Canadians and the world were threatened by this terrorist group, which is no different in its ideology of caliphate creation than Hamas. So I don't know what the kind of discussions are going on in the Prime Minister's office, but I would certainly, as an intellectual and someone as a leader, say, what am I doing here when the bad guys are thanking me? And certainly when I move down to the emotional side, because we're Canadians who believed in our institutions forever. We've contributed to them. We're part of the fabric of this country, no matter how many people want to say we're not. We are, and we are definitely part of the fabric. We're committed, we're invested, and our children and grandchildren are committed and invested. But I do worry that a government that can make a decision with the implications that I've just described has our best interests at heart, and what they will say to us to assure us that we're safe in our own homes. I remember that when the G20 had its conference in Toronto and there were X number of thousand people rioting down on the waterfront, the Toronto police were out with horses stopping the rioters because they were interfering with a conference. And each of us, me included, sitting at the keg last week, having a riotous group go past, yelling and screaming, who's going to come out and protect us? I worry when I see what's happening to synagogues. I worry because the daycare center my grandson was at, some individuals came with banging on the windows saying, "We know where you are." I am concerned that the authorities either in Ottawa, Toronto, or other bigger cities are not doing what they should be doing. And I call on Mayor Chow to do more. I call on our federal government to do more, because I am concerned. What does this mean? And even more reason for us to be loud and proud and noisy as we go forward.
With that in mind, Alan, do you think there's a scenario where the Prime Minister could reverse his intention to recognize a Palestinian state in September with all these implications, consequences that you've laid out. Hopefully he's listening, but is there, do you think, a path where we can reverse this announcement?
Well, hopefully someone from PMO or PCO or Foreign Affairs is listening. So a very good diplomat or a very good politician would usually put some wiggle room into whatever they commit themselves to, as a flag that goes up to see how it flies. And quite frankly, what I read in this kind of strange cart before the horse approach that has been indicated in the Prime Minister's statement is that there is an out. The out is, you know what? What we're seeing is that you're unlikely in the next month to show us any way that you're going to be living up to the promises you made in that phone call. And by no means take the readout of the phone call to be the phone call itself. The readout is probably 5% of what was said in that phone call. So I would suggest, just like Noah has, that this is the moment between now and whenever the Prime Minister thinks he's going to go to the high-level meetings of the General Assembly of the United Nations in September, to say, there is no way in hell that the people you're making a deal with are going to live up to it. So you're buying a pig in a poke, to use an old expression. The reality is you're going to be suckered in. And I don't think Canadians want to see this deal, if it's the art of the deal, really go forward, because he stands on the losing end. We all stand on the losing end. So I do believe that there's some wiggle room here. I do believe if they're listening, they're looking at what on earth they're going to be able to say when the 4 or 5 things are not lived up to, and Canada's gone already and recognized this as a state, because it's very difficult to unrecognize a state. You can refuse to have relations with the government of that state because you have political reasons not to, and we've done that, as you know. But I'm hoping that they will reconsider leading up to that time. What does bother me is that the French have gone ahead and said they would do the same, and as the Brits. And if you've noticed, anybody who's been reading the kind of the small print in this, is that the Brits are even stranger than the French, which is curious to watch how the Brits have done this, is that they have threatened Israel that they will recognize a Palestinian state if Israel doesn't do certain things. So you have the British government saying to Israel, if you don't be good on X, Y, and Z, we're going to recognize this terrorist entity, which I find just gobsmackingly strange. So I'm not convinced that our Prime Minister has to do what he needs to do, that he will go ahead and do this. But I'm hoping through continued consciousness raising and simple, indication of how short-sighted this is, that maybe they can rethink this before he gets on that plane to New York.
And before we get into a bit of advice that you might be able to share with our audience on how to engage and to get the Prime Minister to reconsider, what do you think that this means for the future of the Canada-Israel relationship? We have strong bilateral ties across the economy, education, culture, international development. Do you think there's implications for that relationship and whether it's possible to get the relationship back on track?
Well, look, the relationship has been extraordinarily good up until now. I think this is a moment of truth. The benefits to Canada have been enormous in the Canada-Israel relationship. I don't have to beat the drum on the relationship. I do from the Canadian side. You've got the Israeli ambassador can beat the drum from the Israeli side. But in any event, I think we've been a net beneficiary from that relationship, whether it be in the incredible technical collaboration we've had, agriculture, engineering, ingenuity, startups, you name it. I mean, we aspire to be an Israel in terms of just how they've dealt with their problems. I mean, we have desert farming in Alberta, and we're looking at Israeli technology, drip technology, to help that. We're looking at so many of the issues that Israel is confronting in its formation. Just think about this as a country, Israel. It doesn't have any natural resources, and it's managed to create a huge tech industry. I mean, we had a sort of great tech industry. Unfortunately, it's less than it was. But here's this startup nation that has gone ahead brilliantly. We would love to have that quality of relationship, and we do through our connection with Israel right now. Would the federal government decide to either break relationships or agreements or trade with Israel? I'm not a mind reader. I think it would be not only foolhardy and short-sighted, but it would mean that we're shooting ourselves in the foot, not Israel, because Israel will continue to be what it is. It's a big decision. This is part of those circles in the pond that I was talking about. This is not a two-dimensional decision that the Prime Minister is taking. It's 5 or 6 dimensions. It's a change in the nature of how we function as a state and how our relationship will be with the world and otherwise. One thing I did want to mention, because I sort of my motto is facts before flags. Get the facts right before you start raising the flag. And the facts are just not being dealt with here by our government, and they're going after the flag. The other things are, what does this mean for our relationship with other countries that have not done this, specifically in NATO? How do we justify our recognition of a terrorist base when other NATO officials may not? How do we deal with the issue of supporting Ukraine fighting the invasion by an autocratic state, killing, maiming, drones, missiles? We haven't gone and suggested to the Ukrainians to just simply recognize Donetsk and Luhansk and come to the table with Russia. We've actually supplied weapons. I mean, just think about it. So going back to the example of Canada joining the US when 24 Canadians were killed, and they joined a coalition to get rid of the terrorists. Who joined the coalition to get rid of the terrorists when 1,200 Israelis were killed and 7 Canadians massacred? We didn't. We're cutting off arms sales. Not that we have arms sales, but we did a kind of a nice smoke and mirrors thing about cutting off arms. And we're threatening other things. So when Canadians were killed by a racist terrorist death cult, we didn't join a coalition. We're rewarding the terrorists. So I think real Canadians out there, maybe it's just the summer, maybe they're just not, they're off at the cottage and Georgian Bay is super at this time of the year. The reality is we need to bring that to the attention of our political masters. So this is another part of the message going out there. And say that in your message to the political MPs. Say, look what you did, what you supported when 24 Canadians were killed in the 9/11. How about in 10/7 and what you're doing now? We expect you to live up to the values and ethics that we hope you have as a government.
Strong message for local MPs. Alan, I want to ask you just to do a bit of personal reflection. And you've served as Canada's Assistant Deputy Minister of Legal Affairs at Global Affairs Canada. given your legal experience and provision of legal policy advice to government, when people call up their MPs or when people in your life are asked how to think or how to talk about these issues, what advice would you give them?
Well, I think the first thing is to be entirely polite. I may have been slightly impolite on this venue, but I think be polite because people don't want to listen to you if you're screaming. But also ask to see them in person. In fact, ask for a town hall. Now, that doesn't mean that others wouldn't be invited to a town hall. And I know we've seen what happens when Jews try to speak in town halls about this issue, but I would ask them for that. And then maybe they can see what happens. But the reality would be to ask them to actually meet you face to face. In fact, to avoid the clash issue, maybe invite them to a synagogue, invite them to someone's home, get 100 of your favorite friends together and say, look, we're inviting our MP to come in. Come and talk to us about these issues. These are important. And remember that elections do come up and they'll be coming up again at some point. But also to say, and the questions are, is this the Canada you are representing? What has gone sideways in our values that you can be doing this? How come we are supporting the bad guys? And if they say, well, we've seen these pictures of starving children, yes, we've seen pictures of starving children. Many of them we've been shown are not real. There may be a real hunger starting there, but I mean, even in the pictures of the Israeli hostages, we have seen the hands and the bodies of those handing them a cup of something to be incredibly well fed. So when we're looking at starving, we're seeing that the hostages, Israeli hostages, are being starved. So let's be more reasonable about where we're going and talk about what the values are for Canada.
On that same vein of what people can do to take action locally, many people in our community are feeling isolated, unsure about how to talk about what's happening. We know that there's division within the Jewish community, which plays directly into Hamas's strategy. Can you expand a little bit on your thoughts about Hamas's plans vis-a-vis the Jewish community?
Well, I mean, they've been brilliantly successful. I think nobody actually understood the psychological plan that was put in place by Sinwar prior to 10/7. And speaking to Israelis. And one of the things I have done is I, like many other Jews, have gone to Israel. So I spent 10 days in Israel just before the Iranian bombing campaign, speaking to Israelis, young Israelis, older Israelis, politicians. I sat with the parents of hostages in Hostage Square in Tel Aviv. I met with hostage family representatives and discussed what they were going through and what they wanted the world to be aware of. Also spoke with members of the Muslim community in Jerusalem and the Christian community. So I would suggest that others do the same, feel informed. So when people say to me, oh, you're only getting your information from the Jerusalem Post and the Times of Israel and things that you like to read and Noah Tishby, I'm saying no. I was there. I was on the ground. I was at the Nova Festival site. I was in Nir Oz. I was in Nahal Oz, and I was in Sderot. I spoke to the people who were there. And I also spoke to people who are being impacted by this. So feel joined up because the interesting thing was that Israelis, when they spoke to me, they said, we worry about you. This was the weirdest thing. I'm coming to Israel to say I'm worried about you. This we were doing in a bomb shelter after the Houthi missile was coming over during a meal. And they said, no, what we read about what's going on in Canada is we're really, really worried about you. So in a strange way, our affinity and our union with our friends, brethren, co-religionists, others in Israel is even stronger. So don't feel alone. And the other thing is reach out in our own community and speak to those people who may or may not have differences of views. I think all of us have been at a table where we've talked to people around the table who don't always share the same views we do. Someone said, I'm not hard of hearing, I'm hard of listening. So maybe be easier at listening. You may not agree, and I think it's up to you to put your view forward as well. But I have taken heart in the number of people that I become friends with, people I've never known before. I decided, how do I reach out and say what I want to say? And I've started writing about it as a way to say to Canadians, because I'm using mainstream press and other things, is to say, start thinking about it. But what I've gotten back is many Jews who are writing to me, and others, and non-Jews, allies, who are writing to me and saying, thank you for saying things I thought of saying but couldn't quite articulate. And I think take heart from those things. And at the end of this webinar, I want to run through a few of the names of some of the people that have given me inspiration and who have helped me get through this very difficult time, but have given me an incredible sense of strength and a sense of mission and a sense of clarity that I think all of us can have.
I think, Alan, let's dive right into that. And what gives you hope, what gives you strength in this difficult time? How do you stay grounded and feel inspired, with thinkers and leaders or sources that really help you to get through the day to day?
So I know that there's so many others who think like me, may not be identical, but who have words of wisdom, and I listen to them in a way that I never did before. I mean, I'm a founding member of the Luddites Are Us support group when it comes to getting involved with podcasts and other non-traditional media. And I've realized, I think all of us grew up believing that CBC was the oracle. I loved CBC. Whatever they said on CBC was great. CTV was terrific until they got rid of Lisa LaFlamme, which I was absolutely devastated by. But I also had got really concerned at what I was starting to hear, because I didn't hear what I knew to be voices like my own. And I think what we have to do is to, maybe that's another campaign, is to write to our friendly national broadcasters and say, look, we're looking to you for a much broader sense of opinion. Because when I look at panels on CBC or CTV or some of these others, I don't see the views that I'm expressing coming out. On the contrary, I'm very, very sad that they're not. You tell me when you think you'd like me to talk about the inspirational voices, and I'm happy to do that as well and talk to you about some of those folks who are, many of whom are Canadians. And if our audience has not tuned into them and wants to get their children, grandchildren, or others to help them figure out how to get podcasts, it'll open a world that will help them feel that they're joined up with others who are like-minded and are not alone.
I think that would be great for you to go through a bit of that list of people that you listen to that helps inform your thinking, and really the community can have access to, so that they're not alone. They feel like they have a community.
So what I would suggest then is I'll give you some names, and when you do send this out or put this online, you can maybe fill in with how to get hold of them. So one of the most important voices that has come out of this period since 10/7 is a guy by the name of Dan Senor, and he has started a podcast called "Call Me Back." A remarkable American. He, in fact, is not new to this. He's an incredible friend of Israel, co-authored the book Israel Startup Nation. And he has some of the most intelligent voices, both within the United States and in Israel and other places, who come and help you digest what exactly is happening, because it's some of this is impossible to understand, and you don't get into the nitty-gritty. An Ottawa-based friend and colleague of mine, Casey Babb, who is a tremendous writer, expert on Israel and on anti-Semitism, and he has not only his lines on LinkedIn, but also he has his Substack, which is called The Reckoning. And then another wonderful Torontonian, Adam Hummel. He's a Toronto-based lawyer, writer, and community activist. He has a Substack called Catch. He's not with us tonight because he's camping with his kids, but he's promised to stay in touch. And his recent post, A Manifesto for Jewish Power in Canada, is a 10-point plan of what you can do to be relevant and also empower yourself. And that's what we need. Others, who some of you may have heard, are Douglas Murray, a non-Jewish ally, journalist and writer, whose recent book is called On Democracies and Death Cults, Israel and the Future of Civilization. Once you start going on YouTube and watching Douglas Murray, you just will stop eating and just listen to him. Another brilliant person, 35-year-old Natasha Hausdorff, a UK-based lawyer, who is a brilliant lawyer in international law and works for UK Lawyers for Israel. Just go on to her podcasts, which explain just what Israel is doing under international humanitarian law and what it's not doing. That this is not a genocide. Defending yourself is not genocide. It's called war. So the word genocide has been kidnapped and taken over by those who want to pin it on Israel together with apartheid state. Interestingly, a Syrian-born German activist, Rowan Osman, is also an advocate for normalization of relations between Arab countries and Israel. Tremendous person, an ally, a friend, and she calls herself an Arab Zionist. Einat Wilf, many of you know Einat Wilf. She's been around Canada, former Israeli Knesset member, activist. She's a writer. She gives you clear points of argument with those people who say to you, what is Israel doing? Why are they doing it? It's not legal. And she will give you the points to use in your arguments. And the wonderful Pat Johnson, who is a Canadian writer and ally, and in his own words says, he smacks down anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and general hypocrisy from a progressive gay Canadian perspective. And his Substack is called Pat's Substack. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. So when you leave this event, you're not alone. I'm saying to you, you can reach out to me, you can reach out to others, you can talk to us about issues. If you have an interest in approaching either friends or colleagues or workmates or people in your golf club or your gym, and you don't know what to do, I think so many of us are happy to help you come up with language. And also to say to you, just stick in there, because we're not going anywhere. Israel's not going anywhere, and we're certainly not going anywhere.
And I'm going to add one more to that list, which is you can follow Alan Kessel on LinkedIn, stay up to date with his publications. And thank you, Alan. Thank you for inspiring us, for giving us a little bit of hope at the end of the evening. And thank you to everyone who joined. I think this conversation was everything we hoped it would be, getting the information we needed, understanding the principles at stake, and then recognizing that many in our community are feeling lost or isolated, but that tonight was about coming together, not just to learn, but to support one another and to feel empowered to act. And you can stay tuned for more webinars from CEJA. We'll be bringing more content to help you feel more engaged with your member of parliament. You heard Noah say it, and I'll say it again. The most important thing you can do, call your member of parliament. If you've already called them, listen to Alan, call them again, book a meeting, bring your friends, bring your family, take a photo, post it on social media, and ask other people to do the same. Tomorrow, you'll receive a follow-up email. It will have an advocacy brief and key links that will help guide your next step. And you can also visit our action hub for talking points, to call your MP and report back on how it went. And I think, let's just keep saying to one another, you're not alone, and we're in this together. Thanks.
And Am Yisrael Chai.
Am Yisrael Chai. Good night, everyone. Laila Tov.
Bye now.